It is such a pleasure to have Henry Cisneros with us today, and we sit on this incredible USC campus. You served on the Board of Councilors for the Sol Price School of Public Policy here at USC. Although you have ended your tenure, I can only imagine that the contributions you made have changed the school forever. I'm wondering if you could say just a word about the intersection of policy and theory and practice and different sectoral experience that probably is represented by the school, and why it would call your attention to the work.
It's, I think, pretty clear that we could have all kinds of policy discussions and interesting conceptual discussions about where our cities are going and what we ought to do. But unless we have people who can execute, who can carry it out, it's just so much talk. And unfortunately, a lot of academic discussions sort of end up there. You will know from your time in Detroit that it takes a lot of players, a lot of listening, a lot of bringing people together around ideas to move a modern American city. One of the strengths of the Price School is it focuses on those who are going to be the next generation of administrators, managers, and leaders. And it's done a pretty good job. It's one of the higher ranked schools of public policy in the country. And it has a stable of people that have been produced for California and for the country who are making a significant difference.
If we weren't here, I was trying to think of where else we might be, and there's one place that came to mind. It's the poorest census tract in San Antonio, and it's this little storefront that used to be a print shop. Tell me a little bit about that location, would you?
Well, I grew up on what's called the west side of San Antonio. It was once a German neighborhood with workers for the railroad populating the area. And then in the 1920s and 30s, as various waves of immigrants came from Mexico, the revolution there, economic circumstances, it became the most dominant Hispanic area of the city. My grandfather came in 1926. He was a printer in Mexico and had various jobs before he created his own print shop, and he grew it to one of the largest print shops, a union shop in San Antonio. It prospered and served its purpose for 7 decades. It is now in what is called the poorest census tract in the city, and I decided to sell a building that my offices were in downtown, refurbish that structure, and move there for the purpose of being able to influence the path of redevelopment in the area. And thankfully, it's happening. The other 3 points on the compass from the downtown of San Antonio have done very well. It's the 7th largest city in the country, one of the faster growing in jobs, but this point on the compass had been lagging badly for a variety of reasons. And now finally it's getting its turn. So this has been for me an opportunity to take lessons learned from around the country, lessons learned from academic settings, and actually get my hands into the details of architecture, design, community development, street-related work, human capital, local schools, etc. And I think it's a good place to be at this point in my life.
Well, it's such an interesting spectrum of scale. You began as mayor, as a sort of a citywide.
I began as a city council member.
As a city council member. Oh, pardon me, even more specifically. Then moved on to hold responsibility for an entire city, then went on to manage the nation's Housing and Urban Development Agency, and now back to the print shop. I mean, what's the scale that makes sense to you?
When I was mayor, I always admired the people who were actually doing projects. I would be invited as mayor to come for the ribbon cutting on a project, but I knew that there were other people doing the hard work of making the numbers come together and overseeing the construction process and committed to a market solution. My career was incomplete without actually understanding and working at that. The scale has been different for me. I love being a city council member. The best thing I've ever done in my life, aside from my family, is to have been mayor of my hometown. I did that for 8 years. And at the end of it, I felt like an orchestra conductor who could just point the baton at the brass or move another hand toward the percussion and you get a response to make the city move. Not just the city structure, but the civic life and the philanthropic life of the city. As secretary, President Clinton asked me to be the primary liaison to the mayors and the cities. And I traveled to 200 different U.S. cities, in every single one of the 50 states, from Mississippi Delta towns to Native American reservations in Montana, to Inuit villages outside of Nome in Alaska, and all the big cities. So I have worked at different scales. The test is, does it work at the local level?
Well, and the test is also a sort of a weave, isn't it? I mean, when you were mayor, you were conducting, but you were also weaving. You were trying to make these different points of progress add up to something. When you're the HUD secretary, you have a Hope 6 project in Detroit that looks different from a Hope 6 project in Minneapolis, and that's all got to somehow fit together.
On my watch as secretary, and I'm not claiming authorship of this idea, it just became obvious to me that no matter what we did in Washington, getting more money for a budget, getting some new legislation passed, the business of building America's communities must be place-based. And I became a real convert to the idea that everything we did had to be done at the local level. Politics doesn't need to be a career ladder where you say, well, I'm going to start on the city council, but my objective is to be a congressman and then to be the governor of the state. The big issues before our country, before our time, such as equity questions, such as preparing the workforce with training and for dislocated workers, community development at the block level, those are going to happen in our communities, or they're not going to happen at all. We have a big infrastructure bill that allocates $550 million, and Washington sort of has done its part. Now the question is, what's the right project at the local level? What contributes most to the future of Los Angeles? Is it something for the port? Is it something for the airport? Is it some water issues? Is it community development at the block level? And those decisions have to be made at the local level. I truly believe in the work that Bruce Katz did. He was my chief of staff when I was HUD secretary. And Bruce then went on and created the Brookings Metropolitan Center. And it was in that period that Bruce sort of wrote the definitive book on America as a metropolitan nation. We are a nation whose economic future, whose social future will be determined by the successes of our nation's metros. Bruce told us, in just the 100 largest metros, of which there are thousands, but just the 100 largest is about 66% of the population of our country, and they produce about 77% of the GDP. So they're punching above their weight economically, and they touch a lot of people.
You talked about the new infrastructure bill. You and I participated at your invitation in a large conversation with the federal government agencies who are responsible for landing these monies in place. And is there something of a tension between the sort of the atomistic need to get it done, what's ready to go approach of a locality, and the need ultimately to try to somehow recalibrate some of those ways of moving money into communities so that it really does reach?
I think there's a big tension. And the tension is that the money from the people's taxes all across the country go to the federal government, and the federal government has the capacity to sort of bring it back in a coherent form, but almost cannot know what the needs are. The people who know what needs to be done in local communities are local leaders. Take a community like Los Angeles. Los Angeles the city, Los Angeles the county, Los Angeles the metro. It's got a magnificent future. And it's the local leaders who know the port needs to be enhanced. And the airport serves as one of the pinnacles, one of the principal connections of America to the Pacific Rim. And they know that there's schools that need upgrading, and they know what training programs need to be put in place, but have physical realities to them. And of course, we live in the West, in Los Angeles, so there's drought and water questions always pending. It's almost impossible for the federal government to put together a strategy for Los Angeles. Angelinos need to do that. It's a large city, the second largest city in America, but it also has something like 60 municipalities in the overall metro area. And the collaboration needs to be there to do the things that serve the entire area. So the tension, I think, is at multiple places. How do we do the right kind of planning at the local level? How do we convey that upstream through the channels? And then how do we keep the federal government engaged on these big questions?
You mentioned earlier your sense that a mayor can serve almost as an orchestra conductor.
Yeah.
And you've also said to me in the past that probably the highest order skill any public official can have is to listen well. And yet the cacophony of community is really a complicated thing, isn't it? I mean, it's one thing to have someone be interested in a port and someone else be interested in education and someone else be interested in workforce. How do you, at the end of the day, really make something coherent out of that?
First of all, before I go there, let me just say a word about mayor and mayoring. And somebody told me the other day the word mayor has become a kind of a verb. You're going to have to mayor that problem. While I was mayor, I was president of the National League of Cities, spent a lot of time with mayors across the country. And I've looked at different forms of government around the world. And it's interesting, one of the few positions that exists in any form of government, socialist, capitalist, hybrid, is the job of mayor. Because anywhere there's a city, there has to be someone that's designated the leader of the city. And you've seen that dramatically, unfortunately, in the recent events in the Ukraine. It's the mayor that they go to talk about even these dramatic life and death situations that they're confronting. So the job of a mayor is an important one, and it's gotten to be more than it once was, which was the head of the city government, responsible for making sure the garbage is picked up, the police are on the street. We then went to another set of responsibilities, which were convention centers, economic development, airports, big things that move the larger picture. Now we have another concentric circle that includes higher education and philanthropy and churches and other entities that are not generally thought of as part of the government, but they are part of the solution, and they're part of the living organism that is the metropolitan area. And who is the right person to pull all that together, if not the mayor, the only elected person by the whole area? We need the kind of people who will listen and listen broadly to that, as you say, cacophony of demands. There's never enough money to deal with all the needs that are requested. You have a hearing for community development block grants, and you have $50 million to distribute, and there's $250 million worth of requests. So the only way you can successfully do that is to have a clear consensus in the community on priorities, so that those priorities, and it's not just one person's priorities, but a community's priorities, can be explained. This is why we're doing this. In my hometown of San Antonio, we had a recent instance of that. We had a large amount of sales tax money going to buy land for protection of an underground water system. And the money had been going successfully for a long time. But during the pandemic, it became clear that there was a higher priority, and that was to train people who'd been displaced as their jobs disappeared during the pandemic for the new jobs that would be needed. The mayor went to the public and asked for a revote to redirect that sales tax money from people who wanted it for the underground aquifer to a new set of priorities related to recovery from the pandemic, and they voted it by 70%. It was properly explained, and they directed $154 million to job training that had never existed for this purpose. And in the process, came up with a new mechanism to fund the land for the aquifer purchase at a lower and more disciplined level. So that's the kind of intricate transaction that mayors and other community leaders need to be called upon to undertake.
When Detroit was sort of struggling through its downturn from about 2008 to 2013, when we went into bankruptcy, there was such chaos in City Hall with the resignation of a mayor, transitional mayors, no revenue, just on and on. And one of the things philanthropy felt it needed to do was to sort of step into the void and create some scaffolding, something that wouldn't be permanent. We don't have an election certificate, but that would hold the community in vital ways until we could emerge and reestablish normalcy. So we looked at transit, we looked at education, we looked at neighborhood development, and ended up building a lot of machinery that began activating in the most difficult of circumstances. So we get through the bankruptcy, we then return to an elected mayor, and the mayor says, I've got the election certificate, thank you very much. It was clear that the notion of command and control,
yep,
was really important to this mayor. And probably at that point, it was extremely important to Mayor Duggan. He needed to sort of reestablish his credibility, the legitimacy of City Hall, the efficacy of City Hall, and he needed us to step back. So of course we did. But it raised an interesting question about the recalibration of roles in a civic ecology. As you say, it's a living, breathing organism with lots of complexity, with lots of people feeling that they have both the ability and in some ways the sort of the tacit authority to move things forward, even if City Hall doesn't like it. That seems to be sort of another tension for contemporary mayors.
I've long felt that for philanthropy to be maximally effective in a city, it needs to be coordinated, and not just a lot of people who've had traditional habits of what they like to fund, funding it, and they deciding that that's what's most important for the city. In our system, there should be some mechanism for deciding priorities and helping philanthropy come to the table on really important things. I remember being mayor and being very frustrated because we just had run out of money to deal with some very severe homeless problems and some very severe poverty-related problems. But out of another pocket, we could do just fine continuing to fund the symphony and fund the arts groups, and all of them important. It just didn't seem to me right that we couldn't decide on priorities and allocate that money in a different way. So the collective impact model of consensus building is, I think, important. Now, the election certificate is important. It says something. The mayor, who's been elected, has to be very thoughtful about bringing people together and creating that working consensus. Can we look at all the resources available and establish an understanding, why did these problems of poverty and homelessness and addiction and so forth come to be, and how are we going to resolve them together?
In some ways, that sort of very thoughtful, systematic, kind of integrative approach to planning and progress seems to be the only real route. And yet, when you look at the last 2 or 3 years, there is such energy, anger, frustration, urgency, impatience coming out, not just of the racial justice movement, but just out of a younger generation who kind of thinks about processes of change very differently. And I suppose we could go back 20 or 30 or 50 years and say every generation has that quality, but there seems something different about this moment. Do you see anything different in this generation?
Well, I think it is different in several senses. One, the baby boomers have been on the scene for a very long time. And every time we think that we've seen the last, then some other 70-year-old runs again or stays in office. And so part of it is just a generational change. It's time to recognize that there's younger generations who are ready to take leadership positions. They are trained, they are smart, and they do have different things to say. They think in different ways. They've been brought up in different ways. Some of this has to do with just facilitating other generations to come and take their place at the table. And what I find is when you do that, they're smart and they understand that some of what they were asking for is not possible without compromise, is not possible without understanding the roots of the problems and the complexity that they have. I've actually lived through this myself, because in 1977, when the city council in my city went to single-member districts under Justice Department orders, we suddenly went from a city that was majority white, a majority white on the city council, and majority older, to a city that was majority minority, and all of them sub-35, with decidedly different occupations, social workers and professors that had been previously Chamber of Commerce executives and business leaders. The city went through a very dramatic transition. In the first couple of years, it was very messy, in part because the youngsters believed the city government could do anything. And then they discovered the limitations in law, in court orders, in budgets, in hard choices, and things settled in. And I can say that that transition that I've just described was the beginning of the modern era for San Antonio, because everybody was at the table, voices were heard, and because we got to talking about the real things, jobs, incomes, equity, and not just representation and the lack of it. So I do think it's really important to open the doors to those voices, spend the time explaining what can be done with the system we have.
So I think of the city council in Minneapolis after George Floyd's murder.
Correct.
They moved very quickly to defund the police and very quickly recognized that in statute, in ordinance, in practice.
In practicality.
Yeah, they just couldn't quite make it work. And the backlash from community was very severe. Basically wanting to hold the city council accountable for not delivering on its promise. And so, again, in these sort of complicated tension zones that cities have to reconcile, I'm wondering if it is in large part the mayor, but sometimes the mayor kind of gets caught in a vice. I mean, there's not much Mayor Fry in Minneapolis can do about that. How much can the private sector play a role in those things? The police is sort of a different set of issues, but when I think of your San Antonio 2020 plan and the centrality of the private sector in driving a very different vision and operationalization of the vision.
I think the private sector clearly has a role. I'm a big fan of city goals programs. I grew up in an era when Dallas came into its own because the then mayor of Dallas and major business leader, Eric Johnson, who was the head of early computer company, set in place what he called goals for Dallas, 1968. And I've subsequently seen efforts of that type in many other places. And I tried it as mayor of San Antonio in 1983-ish, and we had 500 people, an assemblage like the city had never seen in diversity, crosswise, business, community organizers, church-related leaders, et cetera, in task forces working on where we headed, and it was highly successful. Much of what has been accomplished in San Antonio since came out of that process. I'm just a believer that you have to listen to what people are saying, not necessarily how they're saying it, which may be jolting and uncomfortable, but the absolute central skill is to dig down and listen carefully and find that little sliver of daylight, that one little sliver of daylight amidst these angry voices, and begin to give people confidence that you can walk through. I'm a big fan of the community organizing techniques because I saw it work in my own hometown, that organized communities using Saul Alinsky methods that could be very uncomfortable for the decision makers, but in the final analysis, compromise, finding the common ground, taking solutions through and giving people some sense of confidence we're going in the same direction. Democracy requires that. It sounds trite, but democracy requires those values.
You said to me recently that each generation in some ways needs to sort of iterate in its own special way, and you've talked about that. But then you said something that surprised me, which was that you felt that it was very difficult to convince people that they were actually standing on the shoulders of those who came before. That's a hard concept for those of us who believe that progress is incremental and builds over time. And as I hear you describe the lessons that you've gathered throughout your career, there needs to be some basis in previous experience, doesn't there?
Well, one of the things I've learned in my older years is that it isn't necessarily important for those of us who did things before to expect credit or gratitude going forward. It should be enough that we did them, and it should be enough that we made it possible to go forward from there.
I see.
The important thing is to spend time with the younger generation and try to influence, try to teach them in the directions they want to go. We need to have a bigger sense of why we do these things and be quite satisfied if we do the right thing for the right reasons and let the next generation carry forward from there.
You told me about a wonderful new practice that has sort of emerged from your work in San Antonio trying to foster small business, and that you actually felt that small business owners who are sort of now coming up through the ranks have a very different way of how they get technical training, how they position themselves to enter the market. It's not so much that people set up seminars or technical assistance, but the businesses are visited by people who can actually support them. Can you talk a little bit about that model?
Again, there's a lot of value and a lot of truth in the community organizing methods that the Industrial Areas Foundation and others use. The Industrial Areas Foundation was created by Saul Alinsky in Chicago, back of the yards, and it had an iteration in the American Southwest. San Antonio was one of the first places. It was called Communities Organized for Public Services, and it fundamentally changed the trajectory of the city. The neighborhood suddenly had a voice, but it was a disciplined process of community organizing at the church level, at the block level, bringing people who had never been in politics before, teaching them some of the public issues, teaching them how to confront power, and I saw it change the city for the better. Those institutions took root in El Paso, the Rio Grande Valley, Houston, Fort Worth, Austin, Dallas, Phoenix, and Los Angeles, a big presence out here. This is not just abstract talk. This is the hard work of organizing. So I am a big believer in that and those values, and they carry over in execution, the central themes to a lot of the ways we should be delivering services. In San Antonio, we're borrowing from the model of going to people's homes and bringing services to them, something called the promotora model. In the Latino health sector, we're now borrowing from that model and using it in supporting small businesses, going to them and asking them, well, where do you want to go? Where do you think you're short? Where do you think we can be most helpful? Instead of waiting for them to come to a storefront as if they have the time to do that, first of all, and as if they know already what they need. They don't. They need to be brought along. I guess the sub-theme of what I'm saying is the human dimension, the face-to-face dimension, the recognition of people having to learn new things has to be part of the way we think about government. And I think the core of it is, if we're going to get personal, if we're going to get to people, if we're going to get to understand their real needs, then a lot of this has to happen at the local level.
And maybe to bring it full circle, is there any advice you would give to a philanthropist who's trying to work at this granular level to sort of build community capacity, to strengthen the decision-making machinery of city government?
I would say philanthropy has an interesting place in American life because those are resources that in other systems would be coming to the public to distribute, but they're not. They're staying with an elite. If philanthropy is going to assert that they're doing the most important things for the society, then they need to let the society have a voice in some of those priorities. And a lot of philanthropy is more a function, a result of habit. They've been doing something for a long time. This is what they champion. They champion the symphony or they champion the museum. And philanthropy has to change with the times. I don't want to suggest that it shouldn't continue to fund those things, but if we want to say that that money is being used in the best interest of the society, then let's try to establish what is the best interest. It is a big responsibility. Our system is what it is. We've created a way for families and corporations and businesses and others to set money aside, get tax benefits for doing it. But Lord Almighty, let's use that money to where it can make the greatest difference.
It's sobering because as I think of philanthropy, it is this enormously diverse ecology. It's family, individual donors,
Correct.
It's community foundations, it's private foundations, it's all sorts of things. And you can't expect them all to behave in the higher public interest. They have their own interests to pursue. But I do think that we're entering a period in which privately endowed philanthropy, particularly those focused on the local level, have to do exactly what you've suggested. And that requires a little bit of shape-shifting. You know, sometimes it requires stepping into a void, as we had to in the pre-bankruptcy years in Detroit. Sometimes it has to do with stepping away and just sort of backstopping what the government needs to do. Sometimes it needs to take some risks that the public sector just can't take or that the private sector won't underwrite.
Our system works, and it has worked and created some beautiful things, but it hasn't worked perfectly. And the way we know that is because inequality continues to increase. And we know that because there's too many people on addiction. And we know that because we walk down the street and walk over people who've been sleeping there all night in the cold. And we know that because there's all kinds of inequities and diseases and their impact. We can do better. And philanthropy's dollars are too valuable not to use them in the fight. Resources are scarce. People argue against paying any more in taxes. Local governments are starved for resources. So why don't we make 2 + 2 = 5 and make our money go farther by making the right decisions about it?
In the face of such enormous complexity, federally, locally, and everywhere in between, in the face of so many different inputs into civic life, I find it reassuring, for one, that there is someone who seems to be at full comfort with all of those things and can somehow sort it out, make sense of it, and, as you say, explain it to others. So it's been such a privilege having you here with us. I hope we can continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rib.